Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Learning with My Rabbis. Today, I'm very, very excited. It's one of my very first teachers back when I went to University of California, Davis, Rabbi Dr. Devorah Schoenfeld. Today, she is the Associate Professor in the Theology Department at Loyola University in Chicago. She teaches there Judaism, Bible, Comparative Religion, and Jewish-Christian Relations. Her book, Isaac on Jewish and Christian Altars, is about Genesis chapter 22. Takes a look at it in Rashi as well as in the Christian biblical commentary, the Glossa Ordinaria. I'm sure I mispronounced that, but she'll help us with that in a bit. She takes a look at different approaches to the Akedah, which is one of the central stories of the Tanakh, and coming up with the high holidays, an important story for all of us to be thinking about. She's a member of Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel in Chicago, and she holds a master's in comparative religion from Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, as well as now rabbinic ordination from Yeshivat Maharat. Rabbi Dr. Schoenfeld, it is a pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Well, it's great to be here, and I'm glad to be virtually in Toronto, where I grew up, downtown, Lawrence Spadina, Narayever congregation. I'm sure many of your congregants know of it.
Absolutely. It's such a small Jewish world that you ended up for a time in California and Davis, where I was, and here I am now in your hometown. You're now in Chicago, which is not so far away. It's amazing, the world of connections and things that happen. I remember very distinctly, and we'll talk a little bit more later about biblical criticism and all of that, but you were actually the very first class I had in university. And it's one of those stories that I imagine for you probably don't remember because you've had so many students over the years, but for me, it was a very formative moment. I thought university was going to be easy. My very first class was Hebrew Scriptures. And the very first question my teacher asked was, why are there two different names for God in the beginning of the book of Bereshit? And everyone sat there quietly. I looked around the room and my hand finally went up because I had spent the last few years of high school hanging out a lot at Chabad. And I gave Rashi's answer that one is for God's attribute of mercy and the other God's attribute of justice. And then you shattered my world when you explained that there were different authors and they were written at different times in different places. And now, years later, you've also become ordained now as an Orthodox Rabbi. But even back then, you were a very observant and practicing devout Jew. And you very much helped to shape my own feelings and beliefs and approaches to how I could study the Bible academically, as well as hold my own kind of religious beliefs. So I would love today to get into a little bit about how you kind of see those two interacting, but also just start with, how did you get into biblical criticism? It's such an interesting field, and how did that kind of academic Bible study draw you? So
my academic work is in Parshanut, is in Rashi. So like you, I'm familiar with Rashi on the Chumash. But as I read Rashi and as I read Midrash, it seems obvious they're reading the same Bible as we are. And they have the same problems as we are. So part of what I find interesting about reading Rashi and about reading the medieval commentaries is how they grapple with the problems that they find in the text. But to see that, you have to honestly be able to see the problems in the text. So for me, that's how biblical criticism and history of biblical interpretation work together. That by identifying the gaps in the text, the breaks in the text, the places where the biblical text feels internally inconsistent, that can help you also understand what the medieval exegetes were seeing, what the people who developed Jewish theology were seeing, and how they brought these different pieces together.
What about for us today? I get a lot of questions about this. Actually, I recently taught who wrote the Torah for a Shavuot shir, and we looked at some different textual issues in it. But from the religious perspective, like, how does it change your understanding of where Torah or where mitzvot come from, the idea that the Torah might have some human authorship?
The work of developing Torah and mitzvot is always a collaboration between humans and God. And that's always the case, however you understand it. By the way, when we talk about Torah having human authorship, that's not something that I would say that I believe in a dogmatic sense. I would say when you step back and you look at the Bible and just try to see what it is, then what you see is a text that looks like it was written from different perspectives. Then what you do with that is a different question. Being an academic and being a devout Jew, or being an academic and being a rabbi, I feel like are two different lenses with which to engage the same question. The spiritual discipline of academia is the discipline of being able to say, what does this text look like? What does it look like on the face of it? If I try to not impose my beliefs on it, what does it look like? Then the work of being a religious Jew is the work of asking, so what does God want from me? The work of being a rabbi, of being a Jew in community, is asking, what do these texts mean to me in my community? And being a Jew, it's always those two things. It's never just the individual. It's never just me, myself, asking what God asks from me. It's asking, how is God speaking to my community? And as an Orthodox Jew, halakha is never, ever based just on a literal reading of the biblical text. It's always based on a history of interpretation, of discussion, multiple opinions, traditions, a long history of people doing their best to try to figure out how to hear God's will, both for the individual and for the community, in this very fragmented, very difficult to understand biblical text.
I absolutely agree, because so much of what is Jewish law today is not a literal reading of the Torah. It's as it's filtered down throughout the millennia through the rabbinic thought and teachings, which I think maybe is a good segue to the second part of your career of why did you get into, or why did you decide you wanted to be a rabbi? How did that come about? Was it something you've always been interested in, or was this a later addition into your academic career?
When I was a little kid, I wanted to be a rabbi. But I also wanted to be Orthodox. And I remember when I was a teenager, talking to people in NCSY about how I was going to be an Orthodox rabbi when I grow up. And then in my 20s, I was involved with a group of women who were trying to get Orthodox ordination in Israel. Eventually, I backed away from it because, at a certain point, you have to live your life in the world that exists. And I went into academia, and academia treated me pretty well. But I always felt like there was something missing, that just being an academic didn't adequately describe who I was or what I was trying to do. The thing about being an academic is academic degrees come from a secular institution. They come from outside of the religious community. An academic degree qualifies you to speak about a religious community. It doesn't qualify you to speak from a religious community. So there was something that always felt a little bit inauthentic for me about just being a professor and not having rabbinic ordination. When Yeshivat Maharat opened up, I was already teaching at Loyola, but I have to say there was a part of me that was like, okay, I need to quit my job and go there. But I wasn't going to do that. But there was a part of me that wanted to. Anyway, so a few years later, they started this program they call it the Kollel, but it's a ordination track for women who are mid-career, who would have been ordained 20 years ago if the opportunity exists. And they allowed me to pursue ordination through distance learning with occasional visits in a way that allowed me to continue doing my work at Loyola. And I was really very lucky to be able to do this program and to receive ordination from them.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful that they have that opportunity, not just for women in the Orthodox world now, but because of this online opportunity for women that have the ability and the skill, but didn't have the opportunity when they were first starting their careers, having to give everything up and quit and restart. That's wonderful. Yeah. Before you said, you and I are both familiar with Rashi. but I have a feeling you probably are much more familiar with Rashi from all of your academic work and study than I've been at this point in my life and career, at least. And right, in a sense, right, it's a travesty of things that women like you that have this knowledge can't speak for the tradition, right, as a rabbi previously. And it's wonderful that you have this opportunity, and God willing, many more of our female scholars will partake and get to do this as well. I'm curious, because I know a few different people that have graduated from Yeshivat Maharat, and there's different titles some women have chosen to take as a female Orthodox rabbi. I've heard Rabbah, Rabbanit, Maharat even, I think, for some. Why did you choose to go with rabbi as opposed to one of the other titles?
So I see it as a purely grammatical issue. The problem with rabbi is that it's in the masculine form grammatically. And in Orthodox communities, it's assumed that everyone is fluent in Hebrew. And if you go in there and introduce yourself using a term that's in the masculine when you are not a male, the people will laugh at you. So that's the grammatical issue. So many ordained women who are working within the Orthodox community use the titles Rabbah or Rabbanit, which are grammatically feminine. Rabbah is the correct term in modern Hebrew. That's what the Academia Lashon Hivrit recommends for ordained women, is Rabbah. Rabbanit is more classical. The way I see it is it has to do with how you talk. If you say Moshe Rabbeinu and Chumash, you should probably say Rabbanit. If you say Moshe and Mikra, you should probably say Rabbah. If you say Moses and Pentateuch, you should probably say rabbi. I teach Catholics now. I'm teaching in the university. I tend to say Moses and Pentateuch, so rabbi makes sense. When one is speaking in English, one normally does not worry about the Hebrew grammar connotations of rabbi. And the titles Rabbah and Rabbanit, I think, would be less intelligible to audiences who are not fluent in Hebrew and who are outside the Jewish community. So that's why I chose rabbi. The title Maharat, Maniga Ruchanit, so religious leader, is a title for women who choose not to use the title rabbi, or often the institution that they work for prefers that they not use the title rabbi, to establish that what they're doing is something slightly different. And some women will choose to use that title. And that's a different word from rabbi that is for women who want to make clear that what they're doing is they're still ordained, they're still leaders. It's a title that indicates leadership, but that they don't want to use a title that's been traditionally associated with male leaders.
It's another hurdle, in a sense, that women have to go through to find their way in the world of Jewish leadership and Jewish teaching. One of your classmates, I believe you mentioned before we went on air, was recently in the news in England, a teacher of Torah for many years who was let go after getting ordained. I believe the newest news is actually they've hired her back because it's an academic as opposed to a religious position, or some bifurcation they made of the two. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, or just in general, how some of your classmates are being treated and accepted in the world at large.
So, look, it's an uphill battle. What I can say about Lindsay is I had a chance to learn with her. We were in the program together. She's a great scholar. And I'm certainly glad for the institution that she works for, that they were able to recognize that and they were able to bring her back. And I know it's good for her students. The women of Yeshivat Maharat, those who work within the Orthodox community, often face barriers. Often they have to create their own roles, create their own spaces. It's a work in progress. Having said that, I know that can be a struggle for women in other places too. I've also faced misogyny in my work in academia. There've also been places in academia where I've been excluded because of an old boys network, because of kinds of mentor-mentee relationships that exclude women. So when I chose to remain within and work within the Orthodox world, it's not choosing a place where there is misogyny over a place where there isn't misogyny. It's negotiating what kind of misogyny I'm willing to live with in order to have the kind of spiritual life that I want and that I believe in.
It's a difficult choice. I remember when I spent a year at Pardes studying in Jerusalem before picking which rabbinical school I wanted to attend, because I really wasn't sure. And in the end, I really wanted to be part of an egalitarian community. So I went with the conservative rabbinical school. But almost everyone in my class that was at Pardes that started the year with me saying they wanted to go to one of the conservative rabbinical schools ended up at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah at YCT because it had very much that sense of learning and Jewish practice that I think for all of us was so important. And it's hard to have to pick those values, right? I think for my friends, even egalitarianism was an important value of them. Most of them are raised in the conservative and reform community like myself. But at the end of those days, the other values pulled them into that. I sometimes think about that choice as well. It was a hard one for me to make, but to be at a place where I could sit next to my sister and my mother in shul was very, very important to me. But at the same time, I see it's so difficult that we have these different spaces that have these, there's no perfect fit, I guess, for anyone is maybe what I'm looking for. I'm curious, you mentioned, and I'm sure there's certainly misogyny in the and issues in the academic world. Have you faced any issues in the academic world taking on the title rabbi?
I want to say something first in response to your previous statement about making choices. That's my sister actually is a Reconstructionist rabbi.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we ended up making different choices about this, right? For her, the egalitarianism was something that she really couldn't compromise. And I absolutely respect that. So, yeah. So, okay, pushback about rabbi in academia. So it helps that I work for a Jesuit Catholic institution where there are other ordained people on the faculty. And for a long time, that was the default at Jesuit Catholic universities, that most of the people teaching there would be ordained clergy. That's less so now. But still, the idea that one should have a personal stake in the tradition that one teaches from, I think that's normalized there. I think other places in the Jewish studies world, that's less the case, that sometimes the Jewish studies professor is seen as more having a role standing outside the community, sometimes critiquing the community. That's not really my role. But I think there's some places where the Jewish studies professors expect to function that way.
Sure. Now, you teach at a Christian institution and you teach I believe, an audience of Christian students, right? Future, are these future leaders or clergy? Or?
Some. I do teach a lot of Gen Ed classes where they're freshman students.
Okay.
Except instead of reading Rashi, they've been to their Catholic Sunday school, and that's what they're coming in with. So I do enjoy teaching those classes. But I do also teach future Jesuits. I teach doctoral students in Catholic theology, Catholic ethics, and New Testament. So I do teach some future leaders in the Catholic Church, and that's very rewarding. I also have been teaching during the summers. I've been teaching at Spiritus, where I teach future Jewish leaders. So that's also fun. So I'm glad to be able to have my foot in both worlds.
So I served for a year as the chair of the Willowdale Interfaith Council. It was just me, a couple of ministers, a priest, a imam, just in our local neighborhood here. But I was very excited that I've just recently joined the board of the Christian-Jewish Dialogue in Toronto, which is a very old organization bringing Christians and Jews together for interfaith work. So I'm curious a little bit, since you have a very unique perspective as a rabbi teaching at a Christian institution, studying both texts and teaching both texts, how do you see kind of Christian-Jewish dialogue and interfaith work, and what can we learn from each other or teach each other, or really what's the value? What are we looking for when we bring people together and do that kind of study?
I see my role as an ally to Christians who are working to figure out their own relationship with Jesus, with the Bible, and with the Jewish background of both of those things. That every Christian, by virtue of being a Christian, the minute someone says, I am a Christian, they're thinking about a Jewish person, Jesus Christ, and they are thinking about a Jewish theological concept, the idea of the Messiah. Now, they might not necessarily have thought that much about the Jewish roots of both of those things, but it's still central to who they are. So my role is to help Christians who want to think about what it means that Jesus was Jewish, what it means that every single book of their Bible, or almost every single book, it's possible that some books that Luke was written by somebody who wasn't Jewish, possible, but that almost either every single book or almost every single book of their Bible was written by someone who was Jewish. What does that mean? And that can be a hard question for Christians. And it can be useful to have someone who has a background in Jewish texts to walk through it with them.
I'm curious on the opposite side, right? Because you're bringing in Jewish commentaries and Jewish perspective. Are there things that we as Jews can learn from later Christian interpretations of our stories?
So one thing that I sometimes encounter in the Jewish community is a lot of hesitation about talking about God or talking about love. And sometimes people will say, if you talk too much about God or loving God or feeling God, or that people say, hey, that sounds Christian. And that feels very sad to me. That feels like a lot to give up. That belief in God, love of God are things that are very deep in the Jewish tradition. And there's no reason we have to be hesitant about talking about these things. So when we hear Christians talking about God, rather than to say, okay, that's what they do and we don't do that, to say, maybe we could learn to talk about God more. Maybe we could learn to talk about love more. Maybe we could learn to find the places in our own tradition that allow us to speak about these things. Beyond that, I know that the Jewish feminist thought and Christian feminist thought that there's been a lot of cross-interpretation. I've certainly learned a lot from Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza about how to read the Bible through a feminist lens, looking and to try to find what's nourishing in it, even when you encounter things that are difficult to read.
I really love that answer about God and love. I think one of the most spiritual moments I ever had was in a synagogue. I've had a lot of spiritual moments out on a mountaintop and camping and rivers and oceans, but sometimes indoors at a synagogue in a sanctuary, it's sometimes hard to have those moments. One of the most memorable ones and meaningful ones I had was Neshama Carlbach came to my synagogue that I grew up at in LA with a Christian Baptist choir to sing Jewish music with them backing her up. And it had me thinking the same thing. Christians do a great job of saying just hallelujah, praise the Lord, and just shouting out for joy when they feel moved, while Jews stick to this strict liturgy, and anything that isn't already in there or we're supposed to say is it's a lack of decorum. It's not quite the same. But even these Christian terms, if I got up on the bima and said, "Our Father who art in heaven," my congregation might start throwing things at me. But Avinu Shabbat is exactly the same thing, but we don't think in those terms in the same way. I also always try to not force, but encourage people to think about what they mean by God, because for me, it's the starting point of why we do what we do as Jews, or why we pray is knowing who it is we're praying to, what type of God we believe in, what is our philosophy and theology there. I'm curious, because I'll just put it up on the screen really quickly. We have your current book that's out on the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac from Jewish and Christian perspectives. And you mentioned to me before that you're coming out with an upcoming book with Jewish and Christian perspectives on the Song of Songs. What are the differences or similarities between these Jewish and Christian commentaries from the Middle Ages? Do we have different approaches to text, or are they more similar than we'd imagine?
So what's interesting about Jewish and Christian commentaries on Song of Songs is how similar that they are, that they're really having the same conversation. That there's two trends in both Jewish and Christian interpretation of Song of Songs. One is that it's about a love story between God and the individual. It's how do I personally love God? And the other is that it's a love story between God and the community. How does my community love God? How is God's love manifest in the history of our community? So methodologically, the two traditions tend to be quite similar and to be trying to do similar things. But then the question becomes, then what's the answer? Like, what kinds of ways can we love God? So Song of Songs becomes a place for both Jews and Christians to think about, what does love of God mean? How do we do it? How do we do it individually? How do we do it communally? How do we see God's love in history? How do we experience God's love in our lives? How do we love God even when it feels hard, even when it feels distant?
Oftentimes, when you pick up a Jewish commentary, right, I can read one thing in Rashi and another thing in Rambam and another thing in any of the other numerous commentaries that make up a page of Mikrot Gedolot. Is it the same in Christian commentaries? Do they disagree with each other, or is there a unified approach to the text and what it means?
So that was what drew me to the Glossa Ordinaria. I would teach Christians about Mikrot Gedolot, and they would say, this is such a great Jewish way of reading, that there's all these different commentaries on the same text. And I'd be like, this was the normal Christian way to read the Bible in the Middle Ages too, right? Like the Glossa Ordinaria has the same layout as the Mikrot Gedolot. It's the biblical text in the center with different Latin commentaries that disagree with each other, arranged around the page. And this is something that I keep noticing in Jewish-Christian relations, that when you see something beautiful in the other tradition, chances are, if you look in your tradition, you'll find it too. That we put a lot of work into telling ourselves that we're different from each other. And that can be very important because, I'm in favor of Judaism and Christianity being separate religions, and sometimes telling yourselves that you're different from each other is a way to make that happen. But sometimes that can mean depriving ourselves of something that actually belongs to us and that is actually ours, right? Just like Jews don't have to give up love of God, because we actually do have love of God. And Song of Songs commentaries is one place where it's expressed. Christians don't have to give up the idea that the Bible has many possible meanings, that you can read the Bible with many different commentaries, because this has been a normal Christian way to read the Bible. There are also modern commentaries, by the way, that take the same format. The ancient Christian commentaries on Scripture and the Church's Bible are both modern reworkings of the Glossa Ordinaria, using the same concept of the Glossa Ordinaria, but in English and for modern readers, putting the biblical text in the center and then having commentaries around. So these are Christian modern approaches to reading the Bible as having multiple meanings.
It's interesting. I think today many people, or at least in the popular world, not maybe in the academic world, look back at the Middle Ages and think of it as a very close-minded time where there's maybe one way of thinking, and anybody who didn't agree with that, right, got burned at the stake or, drawn and quartered. That might be a little later of a punishment. But that, right, disagreement, and especially in religion, was not something that could exist. But it sounds like it's really not the case, that in some ways maybe we're a little more closed-minded today than some of our predecessors were. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if I'm reading too much into that. There are different commentaries on the page from that time.
I mean, it's hard to have answers to that. There are certainly ways in which we have many more freedoms today, but there are also intellectual possibilities that existed in the Middle Ages that are worth recovering. As a historian, I feel like no one generation has all the answers.
That's true. That's why I love that we look to the past to see what we can learn, what we can take from it. And as well, I think it's great to look towards other cultures as well.
One of the great things that can come from learning another tradition is that it can help you go and look at your own tradition with new eyes, to find things in it that you might not have noticed before, that you might not have realized that you wanted before until you saw them somewhere else.
I really enjoy having you with us, Rabbi Dr. Rabbi Schoenfeld. I said it before that I don't know that for you, because you've had so many students over the years, right? Actually, there's another person who was at Davis around the same time who I'm sure stands out, Evan Mays, who is now published. I'm sure the two of you have stayed in touch, and he would actually be a wonderful guest to have on as well at some point. I'll have to reach out to him. But it was only a couple of years that we overlapped at Davis when I first started there, and it was the end of your time there before you moved on to your next position. But you really left a lasting impact on who I am as a rabbi and how I've balanced my views both academically and religiously, and just as a resource there, because you shattered my worldview in that first class. When my hope that Davis or college, university was going to be very, very easy, right? Rashi says that it's nope, that's not the answer. But you also were there afterwards to talk to me, and in your office hours many, many times, and even things like as a freshman when I had no idea what I was going to do for Passover, right? You invited me over with other students and professors on campus that were having a traditional Passover Seder in your home, and something that otherwise I would have maybe had a box of matzah in the dining commons or something, which I remember actually at Davis one year was not kosher for Passover matzah they had. So you helped me not only academically, but to help me find my Jewish place there as well when I was just starting off. So I really am grateful. Before you leave us, is there a teaching or a piece of Torah you can share with us, something that's significant and meaningful to you that we can learn from?
So thank you. And thank you for sharing all of those memories. And I certainly remember that Passover Seder. It was some great times at Davis. And it means a lot to me that you're now out there teaching Torah and teaching in my homeland. And I'm so glad that you're taking the Torah that you learned and you're teaching it in Toronto. So one piece of Torah, I'll share a little piece about Song of Songs that I'm thinking about. So one question that people ask about the Song of Songs, modern scholars who read it, is it one story or is it many stories? Because the identity of the protagonist keeps shifting. The male protagonist is sometimes a shepherd boy, sometimes King Solomon. The female protagonist, at one point, she describes herself as black and beautiful. At another point, she's described as having a neck like alabaster. At one point, she describes herself as being forced to work in the vineyards. At another point, she's described as being wealthy and coming from the desert. Sometimes she's rural, sometimes she's urban, sometimes she's rich, sometimes she's poor. The lovers are sometimes meeting in secret. Sometimes it seems to be an arranged marriage. Sometimes they seem to already be married. Sometimes they seem to have broken up already. Sometimes the relationship seems to be fraught. The emotional content is different. Sometimes she seems to be pulled away against her will. I mean, wanting it, but still like feeling like this is happening to me. It's overwhelming me. Other times she's very proactive. She knows what she wants. All right. So what do you do with this? So it is possible to take these different narratives and put them together into a single story. Ilana Pardes does something very beautiful where she says this is a dream from the woman's perspective, where She embodies different characters in the dream and also imagines her partner in different roles. Okay, you can do that. But it's also possible to say, hey, well, maybe these are multiple different stories with multiple different protagonists. So what's the advantage of that? So if you look at it simply and straightforwardly as a human romance, there's already an advantage of that, because that means what the Bible is telling us about. When the Bible, in its one book devoted to love stories, there's not just one model of what love has to look like. There's different models of what love can look like. There's different models of what love can feel like. There's different kinds of relationships between different kinds of people that are all ways to love. It's also different models of what beauty can look like. There are lengthy descriptions of in the Song of Songs of the man's beauty, of a man's beauty, of a woman's beauty. Maybe it's not always the same people. Maybe there are different ways to be beautiful that are in the Bible. So it matters in its own right, but it also matters religiously. Because if we accept the classical interpretation in which the Song of Songs is about love for God, either by the individual or by the community, then if we recognize the multiplicity in the Song of Songs, what this is telling us is there's different ways to love God. There's different ways in which we can imagine God when we love God. There's different ways in which God can be in this loving relationship. There's different ways in which people who can love God, different people are going to love God. There's different kinds of humans who can love God. There's no one way to be a religious person. There's different, just like there are different kinds of beauty, there's different kinds of spirituality. There's different kinds of ways to be a religious person. And there's different ways to experience the love of God. The love of God is going to feel different, is going to look different, can look different depending on who you are, and depending on which part of the Song of Songs you're in.
I love that. It's such a wonderful message today for diversity and complexity, and just in a world where too often from the outside we see people who dislike the Jewish people. Too often from within we're arguing and fighting with each other, and that I think is such an important message for every Jew to hear and to see. Rabbi Dr. Schoenfeld, it is a pleasure to have you here again. I remember in Davis when I would call you Dr. Professor, sometimes you'd say, you could just call me Devorah. And I would just think back to my Jewish mother would, smack me across the face if I called one of my teachers by their first name in university or anywhere. Even my friends' parents who said, call me Rick, my mom would go, no, it's Mr. Thompson to you.
Well, remember, I had no degrees then. I was a graduate student.
You were a lecturer, yeah, but still, calling you by your first name was not something I could handle, but it really is a pleasure and a blessing for the Jewish people that today I get to call you Rabbi. So mazel tov to you. I know it's a couple of years now you've had your ordination, your smicha, but really and truly it's a pleasure to get to call you Rabbi. And to everyone who joined us this week, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you come back another week for another guest, another teacher who's helped influence who I am. It's always wonderful to get to share some of my past influences with all of you, with my community. Have a wonderful rest of your night, everybody.
Don't love God. If you don't love your neighbor, if you gossip about him, if you never have mercy, if he gets into trouble and you don't try